Hi guys, my name is Bailey Spence, and for my final project, we are going to talk about child neglect and the causes and cures that come with that. So, some facts before we get started is that child neglect represents almost one half of the reported cases of child maltreatment in the United States. However, it receives significantly less attention in the literature and media than other forms of maltreatment, such as physical or sexual abuse. I thought that was really interesting because I found that to be true in my everyday life. I feel that when I watch the news, I hear way more cases reported about abuse than I do that of neglect. And so I went ahead and put that on here because I think that's still true to today. Another one I thought was interesting is that the dramatic increase in caseloads of child welfare programs are generally attributed to the increase of cocaine use among women, and particularly crack cocaine. That one just kind of shocked me quite a bit. And another one I found is that researchers and practitioners in child welfare have also noted that chronicity is an issue with neglectful families. And that one definitely kind of hit me pretty hard. That one I found was a little saddening because, you know, yeah, like we can try all we want, but they're still noting that, these families, it's still becoming a chronic issue with neglect in these families. So I think there's something that we can do to help this and better this. So talking about that first quote we inserted, I just put this chart up here because I found that very interesting that, 75.3% cause of child abuse is that of victims that are neglected. And there's only 8.4 of sexually abuse and 17.2 of physically abuse. But yet we hear way, way more on the sexually and physically abused side than we do the children of neglect. So, some causes and problems. I went ahead and talked about substance abuse and use. And according to the National Center on Addictions and Substance Abuse, parents abusing drugs or alcohol are 4.2 times more likely to be neglectful than parents who did not abuse drugs or alcohol. And when we sit back and think about it, 4.2 times more likely, that's a great higher chance. Even if you just dwindle it down to like the whole nation, your whole state, your county, your town, your home, 4.2 times more likely just because your parents did drugs or alcohol. That's crazy. Crack cocaine also seems to be the most preferred drug for young women who are in their prime age to conceive, and it's the strongest foretell of calls to the child welfare system. So this kind of goes back to that second quote we talked about, is basically, crack cocaine's an extremely popular drug in the age of women that are in conceiving years. And we all know, according to our book and our PowerPoints and everything, that drugs can lead to unplanned or unwanted pregnancies. And everyone knows that life after having a child is stressful. And this stress can add to an increase in substance use. And this increase in substance use can lead to more neglect of the child. And I mean, it just seems to be a very vicious cycle. This is a picture that I went ahead and added. And while we're looking at this, like the child may not actually be partaking in the drugs, he's exposed to it and he can see what's going on. And that right there is just neglect, as can be. Another piece of evidence that I found is that women report problems with social withdrawal in their relationships and fulfilling their role as a mother as a result of the alcohol and other drug use. And this includes perceptions of becoming increasingly lonely and drinking more as a result, and having serious arguments with family because of the alcohol and other drug problems, and losing communication with and setting a bad example for their children. Basically, this means that because of the drugs and alcohol, mothers of the children will begin to isolate themselves and withdraw from society. And while they're doing that, withdrawing into themselves, and are in that high state of mind, they're not taking care of their kids. They're sunken into themselves, and not wanting to get up to go out into society can mean not getting up to take their kid to school or get up to take them to eat or anything like that. So that's another example of how substance abuse can lead to neglect or cause neglect. One other thing that I thought was a good cause for neglect, or can lead to children not being cared for adequately with the neglect, is that neglect doesn't really have a dead set, definite definition. And what I mean by that is that, like, in this in this piece of evidence right here that I'll read to you, while it gives us a definition of neglect, if you pay close attention, it doesn't necessarily have definite limits of what neglect really, really means. So basically, it says that the broad domains of child maltreatment include neglect and abuse. Neglect is defined as the absence or omission of care, which likely results in physical or psychological harm. And this can be compared with the definition of abuse, which is defined as actions that result in harm. Most legal definitions of neglect include potential as well as actual harm. So basically, what that says is that neglect can be this very broad thing, but narrowed down, it's just the absence or omission of care, which could lead to physical or psychological harm. Well, if we read into this next piece of evidence, children have different thresholds for each child has a different threshold for their omission of care, basically. What is omission of care to one child may not be to another. And what I mean by that is, like, one kid may find it psychologically damaging that mom needed him to work during school, so that during his time in high school, so that he could help provide for the family. Whereas another kid could find that same experience to be neglectful, and that his mom's not doing all that she can to provide for him. So with that, in my opinion, is just a difference in thresholds of care. Because of this lack of clear definition, it can be detrimental news for some kids. And since the term omission of care can mean different things for different kids, I feel that we leave more room for error, therefore leaving some kids in neglectful situations because they barely miss a cutoff criteria or are just outside of the vague definition of neglect. Understanding that high-quality caregiving is a factor in determining child neglect, it should not erase any emotional neglect or abuse. So, for example, if a child is being adequately cared for physically, like with shelter or food, emotional or psychological neglect or abuse should not be overlooked and should be taken into consideration when looking at the child's case, because emotional or psychological neglect can be just as damaging as physical abuse or like inadequate physical care, such as food or shelter. And I went ahead and posted some more signs of possible neglect over here as well. So what do we have for cures to substance abuse? I believe that we could look to help the parents of neglected children, as it's always a hope to reunite the biological family as much as possible, as long as it's in the best interest of the child. So maybe helping a child or a parent or caregiver get into a rehab program, help them find a stable job with adequate income, and helping them find a suitable living environment could all help to reduce the amount of child neglect in the family, as well as keep the child with their biological caregiver as much as possible. In controlled studies, though, behavioral family therapy, kind of like a rehab but incorporating the family as well, has indicated positive outlooks within the population of patients that have been sent to treatment due to child neglect cases. So in this particular study, it was hypothesized that family behavioral therapy, relative to their usual treatment, would result in improved outcomes from their baseline to 6 to 10 months after post-randomization assessments, and that family behavioral therapy would be particularly efficacious with mothers of non-drug exposed children relative to mothers of children exposed to drugs who reported relatively less severe behavior problems. So basically, what all of that says right there is that with the information of this study, it is believed that family behavioral therapy can be beneficial for families that have been involved in child neglect cases due to the drugs. And that's good news. Like, that's a step in the right direction, I feel like, and helping to solve these neglect cases and hopefully reduce the amount of neglect cases in the future. Also, we have the cures to a lack of a clear definition, and I personally think that one way we can start to alleviate all, if mainly some, of the child neglect and abuse situations is to give it a very clear and definite definition.